They were wrong by a factor of 2.5, not by a few percent, by 2.5 times. March 1st, 1954, Bikini Atoll, morning. A bomb that was supposed to be powerful became the most powerful nuclear weapon ever detonated by the United States, nearly 90 kilometers away from the blast site. People were exposed to radiation levels that scientists believed could kill them within weeks. Some survived, some did not. This is the story of the greatest nuclear miscalculation in American history. And inside their command bunker, no one saw it coming. They were expecting a powerful explosion. What they witnessed was something far beyond their calculations. Bikini Atoll, the Marshall Islands, the Pacific Ocean, 1946. America had chosen this remote paradise as a testing ground for a new era of warfare. The people who called this place home were forced to leave. They were promised it would only be temporary, a short absence, a return, someday. But they never came back. By 1954, the Cold War had entered a dangerous new phase. The Soviet Union had successfully tested its own thermonuclear weapon. America needed a response, and it needed one quickly, something bigger, something more powerful, something the world would not forget. The operation was called Castle. 6 nuclear tests, 6 attempts to prove the power of a new generation of weapons. The first test was given a simple code name, Bravo. But this was not simply another bomb. It was a completely new design, a new approach to thermonuclear warfare. Scientists replaced liquid hydrogen fuel with lithium deuteride, a material that was lighter, easier to use, and cheaper to produce. The calculations seemed clear. They expected explosive yield between 4 and 8 megatons, a terrifying amount of power. But the scientists had made one critical mistake. Their calculations were wrong. Not slightly wrong, wrong by a staggering margin. The bomb relied on lithium-6. Scientists believed this was the only isotope in the fuel mixture that would contribute to the nuclear reaction. Lithium-7, another isotope found in the same material, was considered harmless, a passive ingredient, a useless byproduct. But they were wrong. Lithium-7 was not just dead weight. No one had predicted it. When the bomb detonated, it began reacting in ways scientists had never expected. It produced additional tritium. It released more neutrons and added a massive amount of energy to the explosion, a chain reaction that was never included in their calculations. 5:45 in the morning, the command ship, USS Curtis, was positioned 30 nautical miles from ground zero. Inside the bunkers, personnel waited. Observation aircraft circled at what was believed to be a safe distance. The countdown had begun. 6:45. Detonation. A flash so bright it could be seen hundreds of kilometers away. In a fraction of a second, the sky turned white. The expected yield up to 8 megatons. The instruments recorded 15 megatons, almost twice as powerful as the worst-case prediction. Castle Bravo became the largest nuclear explosion ever conducted by the United States, and it still holds that record today. The fireball expanded more than 7 kilometers across. Beneath the surface of the lagoon, the blast carved a crater over 70 meters deep. A piece of the Earth itself had been erased in seconds. The meteorologists had a forecast, wind direction mapped out in advance. The wind ignored it. It shifted and the forecast never caught up. The fallout didn't go where the scientists expected. It moved toward inhabited islands. An atoll isn't a single island. It's a ring, a chain of coral islands wrapped around a hidden lagoon, and it takes an extraordinary amount of time to build one. It starts with a volcano, rising out of the open ocean. Coral begins to grow around its edges. Then, slowly, the volcano sinks. The coral doesn't. It keeps climbing toward the surface, year after year, century after century. What's left behind is the ring itself, islands circling the space, where a mountain used to be. That's an atoll. That's Bikini. Not one island, an entire atoll, a necklace of coral islands, scattered around a lagoon, isolated in the middle of the Pacific, a remote paradise by every appearance. And it's exactly here that the United States chose to detonate the most powerful nuclear weapon it had ever built. That morning, no one living on those islands knew what was coming. They did not know that before long the sky itself Rongelap Atoll, nearly 200 kilometers from the blast site, far enough they figured to be safe. That's what everyone believed, until the sky said otherwise. A few hours after the explosion, a strange white ash started drifting down. Nobody knew what it was. Kids ran out and played in it. Some thought it was snow. It wasn't snow. It was fallout. Pulverized coral and reef, blasted off the ocean floor, carried on the wind, and dropped straight onto the island. Within 24 hours, the first symptoms showed up. Vomiting, burns on the skin, hair falling out in clumps. Castle Bravo had reached them, and they never even heard it coming. The evacuation of Rongelap did not begin until 48 hours later. For 2 full days, the people of this inhabited island continued to receive radiation exposure. They lived under the fallout. They ate contaminated food. They drank contaminated water. And they had no idea what was happening to them. They knew about the wind conditions, but the warning came too late. By the time the message was sent, the fallout was already moving toward the islands. More than 60 residents were exposed to significant levels of radiation. But the consequences would not end with the fallout. For decades, the people of Rongelap would continue to face the effects: thyroid tumors, birth defects, cancer. The explosion lasted only seconds, but its impact would last for generations. 130 kilometers from ground zero, outside the official danger zone, or so the map said. Out there, a Japanese fishing boat was working the Pacific. The Daigo Fukuryū Maru, the Lucky Dragon number 5. 23 fishermen on board. As far as they knew, they were in safe water. They weren't. The blast was bigger than anyone predicted. Way bigger. And the fallout didn't stop where the map said it would. It kept going, straight toward them. They saw a flash brighter than daylight itself. For a moment, they did not understand what they... Several hours later, a strange white powder began falling onto the deck. It was not snow. It was not ash from a fire. It was radioactive fallout, tiny particles of coral and soil from the blast area, contaminated by the products of the nuclear explosion. The fishermen had no idea it was dangerous. They touched it with their bare hands. They swept it off the deck. And they continued working. Some even tasted the strange white dust. They did not know that what had fallen from the sky was carrying a deadly invisible threat. Within a week, The crew began showing signs of radiation sickness, nausea, severe burns, bleeding gums. Their condition continued to deteriorate. The Daigo Fukuryū Maru eventually returned to the port of Yaizu, but the fishermen who came home were no longer the same men who had left. They were suffering from acute radiation sickness, victims of a disaster they never saw coming. The radio operator of the Daigo Fukuryū Maru was Aikichi Kuboyama. He received the highest radiation exposure among the crew. At the time, he was 40 years old, a husband, a father of 2 children. His job was to maintain communication between the vessel and the shore and coordinate messages during the fishing expedition. After the crew returned to Japan, they were immediately hospitalized. But Kuboyama's condition began to decline rapidly. The signs of severe radiation exposure appeared one by one. His hair began to fall out. His white blood cell count dropped dramatically. His immune system weakened. His liver began to fail. Doctors used the most advanced treatments available at the time. But in 1954, medicine had almost no experience treating people exposed to radiation at this level. 7 months later, Aikichi Kuboyama died. He became the first officially documented victim of the Castle Bravo test. But what makes his story so powerful is not just how he died. It is who he was. He was not a soldier. He was not a scientist. He was an ordinary civilian sailor, doing his job. A man who happened to be in the path of one of the largest nuclear tests in human history. While he was in the hospital, Aikichi Kuboyama said a sentence that would echo around the world. "I pray that I will be the last victim of an atomic or hydrogen bomb." But he was not. His final wish did not come true. Those words became a symbol of the growing movement against nuclear weapons. A reminder that behind every nuclear test, there were real people, real lives, and consequences that lasted far beyond the moment of the explosion. The news spread across Japan within days. A country that had already lived through Hiroshima and Nagasaki was now facing another generation of radiation victims. This time from an American nuclear test. Fear spread quickly. Japan's fishing industry was hit hard. People stopped buying fish. They were afraid that radioactive contamination had reached the ocean, and that even the tuna on their plates could be dangerous. The United States tried to downplay the scale of the incident, but it did not work. The truth was already spreading, and the world was beginning to realize. Castle Bravo was not just a test, it was a disaster. The U.S. Atomic Energy Commission initially refused to acknowledge the true scale of the fallout. Public statements downplayed the radiation exposure suffered by the island residents. But years later, declassified documents revealed a different story. Officials knew there was a risk the winds could shift. They knew before the detonation. And yet, the test went ahead. The detonation proceeded anyway, despite what they already knew. Rongelap, Rongerik, Utirik, all of them received radiation doses far beyond what scientists had predicted. And the most dangerous part of Castle Bravo was not the explosion itself. It was what came afterward, the fallout. When the 15-megaton bomb detonated, it vaporized thousands of tons of coral, seawater, sand, and the surface layers of the atoll. All of that material was pulled into the fireball, and inside that extreme heat, it became contaminated with radioactive material from the nuclear reaction. When the mushroom cloud climbed nearly 40 kilometers into the atmosphere, those particles began to cool. Then they started falling back to Earth, not as ordinary ash, but as a mixture of crushed coral, dust, and radioactive particles. People did not know what was falling from the sky. Children played in it. Adults handled it with their bare hands. The fallout covered rooftops. It entered wells. It settled on plants. It contaminated food. It stayed on people's skin and clothing. For hours, residents remained exposed. Without knowing, they were receiving dangerous doses of radiation. The fallout contained many radioactive isotopes. Some were especially dangerous. Iodine-131. It collects in the thyroid gland and is particularly harmful to children. Cesium-137. It can enter the soil and food chain with a half-life of about 30 years. Strontium-90. It can accumulate in bones and bone marrow. Along with other radioactive materials that created extremely high radiation levels in the days after the blast. The explosion was far more powerful than expected. The winds shifted, and the radioactive cloud moved east and northeast across the Pacific. In total, an area of more than 18,000 square kilometers was affected. The most heavily impacted locations included Rongelap Atoll, Rongerik Atoll, Ailinginai Atoll, and parts of Utirik Atoll. Near the blast site, radiation levels became so high that remaining outdoors without protection could be deadly. On Rongelap, evacuation did not begin until about 2 days after the explosion. By then, the residents had already absorbed significant radiation exposure, and the fallout did not stop at the shoreline. Radioactive particles entered the ocean. They contaminated marine life, settled on the seafloor, and spread through ocean currents. The explosion lasted seconds, but its contamination traveled across thousands of square kilometers. After the fallout spread across the islands, the US government launched a long-term program to monitor the people who had been exposed. After their evacuation, the affected residents became part of a large medical study known as Project 4.1. Officially, the goal was to treat the victims and study the effects of radiation exposure. Researchers collected blood samples, documented skin injuries, monitored thyroid function, and followed the health of children exposed to radiation for many years. Over time, doctors observed a significant increase in thyroid-related illnesses among some of those affected, including thyroid cancers, benign thyroid nodules, and growth problems in children who had received higher radiation doses. However, not every health issue could be directly linked to Castle Bravo alone. The science was complicated. The consequences were long-lasting. But for many people in the Marshall Islands, years of medical examinations came with a difficult question. Were they only being treated, or were they also being studied as a unique case of radiation exposure? That question made Project 4.1 one of the most controversial chapters in the story of Castle Bravo. The documents surrounding Project 4.1 remained classified for decades. Only years later did previously hidden records become public. They revealed new details about what officials knew, what researchers were studying, and how much the affected communities understood about the program at the time. The radioactive particles from Castle Bravo were detected by monitoring stations around the world, in Japan, across Europe, and in the United States. The fallout from a single test had crossed oceans. Castle Bravo became a turning point. Before March 1st, 1954, the world understood the destructive power of nuclear weapons. But after that day, one thing became impossible to ignore. Radioactive fallout did not recognize borders. It could reach civilian populations hundreds of kilometers away from a test site. The effects of nuclear weapons were no longer limited to the battlefield, or even to the country that carried out the explosion. The Castle Bravo disaster became one of the events that pushed the world toward serious international discussions about banning atmospheric nuclear tests. It was the beginning of a movement, one that would, a decade later, lead to the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The consequences of Castle Bravo were felt far beyond the Pacific. In Japan, the tragedy of the Daigo Fukuryū Maru sparked a massive public reaction. By 1954, millions of people had signed petitions calling for an end to nuclear weapons. A year later, in 1955, the Russell-Einstein Manifesto was published. Leading scientists warned humanity about the catastrophic risks of nuclear war and urged nations to seek peaceful solutions. In 1957, the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs began. Scientists from around the world gathered to discuss nuclear weapons, international security, and ways to prevent future disasters. Then, in 1963, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty. The agreement banned nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. A single explosion in the Pacific had helped transform the global conversation about nuclear weapons. Bikini Atoll remains unsafe for permanent habitation to this day. Levels of radioactive contamination in the soil are still higher than international safety standards allow. The people who were forced to leave never truly returned home. Generations of islanders have lived with the consequences of a test that lasted only seconds, but changed their lives forever. Bikini was once a remote paradise in the middle of the Pacific. Then, on March 1st, 1954, it became the site of the largest nuclear explosion in American history. A reminder that the power of nuclear weapons is measured not only by the size of the blast, but by the lives affected long after the explosion is gone. A single number in a formula, a single reaction that scientists underestimated, and thousands of people who never agreed to become part of this experiment were the ones who paid the price. Aikichi Kuboyama died. The people of Rongelap suffered the consequences for decades. An atoll where generations of families had lived was left abandoned, and the formula behind it all remained classified for decades. The largest nuclear explosion in American history, the greatest nuclear mistake of the 20th century. And it was not caused by an enemy. It happened because of a mistake in understanding the behavior of a single isotope. Inside an American laboratory, a calculation error, a missed reaction, a decision that changed the lives of thousands of people forever. A quiet lagoon, crystal clear water, coconut palms, coral reefs, and small villages where people lived in harmony with the ocean. This was a world where the greatest danger came from storms, not from human technology. Today, Bikini Atoll remains without permanent residents. The palm trees still grow, the beaches remain beautiful, the ocean is calm, but beneath that peaceful surface is the memory of what happened here. A paradise that became the ground zero of the most powerful nuclear test in American history. It looks like paradise. The instruments tell a different story. No one planned a disaster. It happened because of a mistake. Castle Bravo did not stop the nuclear arms race, but it destroyed an illusion that lasted for years. The belief that nuclear tests could be contained without consequences for the rest of the world. After that explosion, humanity understood something it could no longer ignore. Radioactive fallout does not recognize borders. It does not stop at the edge of a country. It does not distinguish between those who made the decision and those who had no choice but to live with the consequences.